Okay, thank you so much for being with us for this next panel. This is really going to be about talking about the results of the survey that Richard outlined, the results of which I find fascinating, by the way. I'm going to introduce my esteemed panel. First up, I want to introduce Kailash Satyarthi, who's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, somebody who has really dedicated his entire life, literally his entire life, to liberating children from slavery, from trafficking. Through his organization, he's liberated over 100,000 children, which is incredible. Can we just give him a round of applause? That is amazing. Next up, we have Helle Thorning-Schmidt, who's the former Prime Minister of Denmark, who steered Denmark through the financial crisis and has really dedicated her life to enhancing educational opportunities for those in her country. And Denmark is also ranked, as we know, one of the happiest countries in the world, which is why we're so keen to get your perspective. And also the former Prime Minister of Bhutan, Dasho Tobgay. Your country has been very much focused on this gross national happiness index. You measure happiness almost like an economic indicator. You have been very passionate about that. And also you're keen to talk about the environment as well. Okay, can we give our panel a round of applause, please? Helle, let me start with you. Because what was interesting about the results that Richard outlined there is that, generally speaking, it seems as though the high-income countries are the most pessimistic. They have the most negative outlook in terms of the future, in terms of the direction of the world. One exception, consistently, is, of course, Denmark. Denmark is a high-income country where people are extremely happy. Just explain the discrepancy for us. Why Denmark? Why is Denmark such an outlier?
Thank you for the question. And first of all, it's great to be here with all of you and old friends on the podium. It's nice to be here and talk about an issue that really should interest us all. What are the biggest challenges of our time, and why do some people feel more confident about the future than others? And it's not only Denmark, it's actually the Nordic countries that feel a sense of happiness that is very extraordinary compared to the rest of the world. So I'll come back to that in a second. Just one word about why people of Asia are not so worried about the future that you would see in wealthier nations. I think that comes down to the fact that the last 20 years, the people who have really benefited from globalization are the 85% that do not live in the so-called West. Globalization is there for them now, and they're benefiting every day in their economic prospects, education prospects, health prospects, almost everything that is worth living for. So that's an important thing. In terms of Denmark and the Nordic countries, I think we have found a good way of regulating the market economy. I know it can feel quite early Thursday morning to talk about capitalism, but I do think that we have found a very good way of regulating the market economy with a lot of redistribution, but also a lot of pre-distribution, so that every citizen that are born Danish or Nordic, they know they have access to an enormous fountain of assets that are good for themselves. What are those assets? That is a high-quality education, high-quality healthcare, a lot of safety, an environment which is positive, very little crime. All those are assets in a person's life. And the last asset that I think is enormously important is freedom. People born in the Nordic countries feel an enormous sense of freedom. And what does freedom mean? It means that my choices will actually affect where I end up. It's not my parents. I'm not limited by the state. I'm not limited by anything. I am a free person. And that freedom, of course, is also accessible for women. And I think that is very much part of the happiness index that we score so high on. Freedom is nothing without women being liberated as well, and I think that's an enormous and big part of the explanation.
So it's people having the right to determine their own future, yes, number one. And then also, just in terms of social equality, Denmark is a place where very few people have too much and very few people have too little.
Yeah.
Which brings me to Bhutan, because that's also a place where, Bhutan offers obviously free education, it offers free healthcare. Similar concept, very few people have too much, very few people have too little. What did you make of the survey?
Well, first and foremost, delighted to be here, and I want to congratulate FII Institute, Excellency Chairman, Richard, CEO. I have not seen a survey of this type ever. I mean, we grew up reading surveys and studying surveys and trying to base policies on surveys, and this survey is something absolutely unique. For one thing, almost every document I read talks about climate change, and I am concerned about climate change. In my country, we are very concerned about climate change, being landlocked, small in the mountains. And here, the priorities are different. Climate change is number 7. Cost of living, financial security, these are in the forefront. And it goes without saying, what the survey tells us is that you cannot sort climate change, you cannot solve climate change unless and until you sort out the other priorities in life. In Bhutan, we are still developing. Yeah? We are fortunate that our enlightened leaders, our kings, have given us this development philosophy of gross national happiness. And gross national happiness seeks to balance economic growth, economic prosperity, which is essential with equity, distribution, and social progress, but also with environmental protection, cultural protection, and good governance. So by and large, given our resource base, given the size of our economy, we are fairly happy, and our repeated surveys show that we are becoming happier. Slightly, we are becoming happier. There's a bit more optimism in our country than in the 13 countries that were surveyed, the findings of this survey has shown.
I think I've seen the Bhutan's sort of happiness surveys. I've seen some of the questions, and some of the questions are fascinating. I mean, it's things like, how close are you with your family? How spiritual are you? Do you have a spiritual practice? There's so many different questions, because it's not just about how you're doing financially, it's how you're doing sort of spiritually and other sort of indicators of a person's overall well-being.
So we look at the conditions of happiness. And the conditions of happiness, as we see it, we divide it into 9 domains. The first 3 are quite straightforward. Yeah? Living standard, it's very important, healthcare and education. And then 2 other domains which are widely accepted, environment and good governance. But it's the last 4 domains that I believe are in the cutting edge of governance and policy making. So you have psychological well-being of the people, time use, cultural vitality, and community vitality. So these 4, altogether these 9 are what we consider the 9 domains that are conditions towards people's happiness. But what is happiness? We have various definitions. Ultimately, it is contentment. Are you content with life? And this survey shows a lot about that. Are you sleeping enough, you mentioned, and I think this survey also talks about sleep. Yeah, and this is why I find this survey fascinating. And eventually, hope. How do you see your government? How do you see society? But how do you see government? And again, this survey provides a lot of insight, at least among the 130 people who were surveyed in 13 countries, and it will do us well to take them seriously.
Kailash, let me turn to you now, because we saw that the biggest priority that most people have is, of course, cost of living, and that is in line with what we've seen around the world in terms of higher energy prices, higher food costs, a lot of it stemming from the war in Ukraine. How important is social protections, especially for the most vulnerable among us? How does that contribute to a nation's overall well-being?
Thank you. I'm not a former prime minister, neither of the future. So
You got something, none of us, you got a Nobel Prize.
Yes.
So
thanks, Richard, for this survey. First of all, I would like to react to these 2. Gandhiji once said that our world has enough to feed and fulfill the need of people, but we can never fulfill the greed of the people. So sometimes our definitions of, well-being and containment and happiness are driven by need and sometimes by greed. So in a number of countries, including in India, where I saw in the report that people are believing in the better future. And that is possible because of the three things. One is definitely the values that links to spiritual values, social values among the ordinary people. And the second thing is the perceptual as well as the real. And that comes from the governance and leadership, both. Now we have seen in the world, which is facing compounded crisis, as well as the competitive issues and priorities, we know the problems and we know the solutions, what works. One of the things you mentioned, and we have been working for that, is social protection. In a number of countries, if you begin with Europe, Europe has been investing in social protection as the top priority expenditure in terms of budgetary allocations in social protection for the last 70 years, and we have seen the results. The countries like Brazil, where they have social protection programs like Bolsa Escola, Bolsa Familia. In India, we have midday meal program for children, or this conditional cash transfer and employment guarantee scheme for poor people, rural people. In Bangladesh, we have programs. Even in India, there are very successful programs like Kanya Shri scheme in West Bengal, or Kanya Sumangala scheme in Uttar Pradesh. They have shown very positive result in terms of uplifting the morale of the people, but also the life of the people. Rescued millions of people from acute poverty, chronic poverty, and so on. So this is something which is time-tested. We have, on behalf of a group, what we launched some years ago called Laureates and Leaders for Children. And we have come out with a report that only $53 billion additional dollars annually can ensure education, healthcare, and protection of every child in low-income countries, including the new mothers, pregnant women. $53 billion. This $53 billion is less than 10 days of global military expenditure. This is little higher than 1% of what the Europeans spend on social protection for their own people. Mm-hmm. People like us were expecting that we will learn from pandemic that world is interdependent, not only just interconnected. We cannot solve any other problem, anyone's problem, and our own problem without working together.
Right.
So we say the world has to learn how to walk together, how to walk together,
how to work together,
how to live together, and how to be compassionate for each other.
Thank you so much for that. So, Hele, I want to likely end with you because we've only got 5 minutes left. One of the things we already know is that most people derive their sense of worth and their identity from work, from their careers. And one of the things that this survey showed that really broke my heart is that most people just see work as a place to help them pay the bills, right? They're not getting real fulfillment out of their jobs. I remember when I first joined CNN 10 years ago, I would go to bed on Sunday and I would be so excited to go to work on Monday morning. And I understand that not everyone feels that way. In fact, that kind of feeling about going to work is extremely rare. Why is that? And how can we find much more fulfillment in what we do every single day?
The role of work is such an important part of understanding the world. And I actually think that the relationship that has changed the most after the pandemic is probably the relationship between employees and employers. We don't no longer want to put everything before our work. We don't want to put health in before our work. We don't want to put our general well-being. We don't want to put our sleep before our work. We have changed how we want to work. And that is the explanation for this term that everyone is talking about, the big resignation. So people are actually looking at work in a different way than they ever have been. And this is particularly true for younger folks. If you look at Gen Z, and I know most about the US and the Western world, if you look at Gen Z, younger people, they're no longer going to work to make money. They're no longer going to work to just do better than their parents. They're going to work to feel valued and also be connected to the values of the companies they work for. So unless we understand that, I think we'll have a hard time getting people dedicated to their work. We have to change the way people work. And I actually don't think that's only a Western thing. I think that's coming to the rest of the world as well. So the answer to the question is that we stop thinking that the world should be the be-all and end-all of our life. We want so many other things, and COVID has actually changed how we think of work. And I think that will last for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, in societies like Denmark and Bhutan, where there's much more equality, where there are very few people at the top and very few people who literally have nothing. What is the motivation for work in a place like Bhutan? In places like America, it is to get promoted, to make money. What is the motivation in somewhere like Bhutan?
Well, first, to continue from what you said, Ella, we call it work. We should call it purpose. We should call it life meaning. And then it takes on a total new dimension. But as long as it remains work, it is drudgery, and you don't want to wake up on a Monday morning. So for you, it wasn't work. Yeah. In Bhutan, well, the Nordic countries and Denmark consistently rank very high in the happiness, World Happiness Index. Bhutan does not rank very high. Yet, I believe that we are generally much more content than the resources we have. And one of the reasons is that it's spread fairly. People feel a sense of fairness. But also there's predictability. Though the kitty is small, at least we know that there's social protection, there's free education and free healthcare. And that goes a long way. Now, unfortunately, in most of the rest of the world, you're talking about surviving in a market economy. And the market economy is structured in such a way that you compete with your neighbors, you compete with yourself, you keep consuming more today than you consumed yesterday, and you can bet you're going to consume more tomorrow. Under such an environment, to be content is going to be very difficult. To be satisfied is going to be difficult. To be happy is going to be difficult, because the world has enough to fulfill your need, but not your greed.
That's very powerful. And actually, we're going to end on that note. You and I were talking before we came in here just about this idea of, in environments that are so competitive, in environments that are that much more individualistic as opposed to community-oriented, it is so much harder to be happy. Can we give a round of applause to our esteemed panelists, please?